video. There we go. So, and it's all loose like this too. That's why it's great. So what I always do is, as we start this up, is say, welcome, World Regional Geography class, Geog 1014, a.k.a. World Regions, here at Virginia Tech, home of the Fighting Hokies. And before I go any further, can I get a shout out in the chat room from anybody or everybody that says you can both see me and hear me, and this is coming through loud and clear? And the reason I always start with that is because there have been times in the past where I just started lecturing, I'm doing all this stuff, and then 10 minutes later, people are like, we can't hear you. The audio's not working. And so, and it tells you, let me do back up to thank, who was it that, Callista Malfoy. Thank you, Callista Malfoy, for subscribing at Tier 1, whatever that means. And Plaid Katie subscribed with Prime. And then we got a shout out from M. Waffer3 that says, yes, sir. First time chatter from M. Rafflin. Welcome, M. Rafflin. Thanks for joining the team. Inky 2050 is back in the hizzle, as is Callista Malfoy, saying affirmative. We have another first time chatter from Manan0306. We have a shout out from Brighton Y125, says, what are your earnings on YouTube? We were just joking about that. My earnings thus far have been $13.27. So thank you all for supporting me for the last year. And I did actually spend that money on a single glass of wine earlier tonight. But I still will thank you for that. So for those first time folks, yep, it is big money. It is big money. We are actually explaining how Twitch works to a colleague here at Virginia Tech who's contemplating or just looking at what we're doing here. So let me ask you all while you're here live, and please do chat it out so we can see your responses. Do you all like this shit? I mean, do you like what we do here on Twitch for online office hours / live interactive lectures? And it's okay if you say no. I mean, my instinct is you're all going to say, yes, you like it. That's why you're here. But there you go. You can see it only here for the Plaidcast. We know this awesome person. They actually graduated like a decade ago. They still tune in. Callista Malfoy is a former student, I'm pretty sure. Inky 2050 loves it. M. Raffin says, yeah, they're pretty cool. All right, just pretty cool, M. Rafflin. We'll try to step our game up tonight. But that's how it all works. And Ethan likes shit talking about Putin. I mean, who doesn't? So that's where we're going to pick up tonight, is that, and I'm going to go back and forth just so you can see how this works. So when you can be in this mode, and I'm sure me and Katie are still just kind of filling this out. So there's probably 20 other ways you can present data, including probably charts and graphs and other things. But the setting we have is Katie names it presentation settings. So when I click on presentation, it sets it up so you have your background that you can put in, and you can move these windows anywhere you want. And so now I'm down in the corner live, and then I can tap into my PowerPoint presentation, and you can change all the settings and text for all that stuff. That's pretty much it.
Pretty awesome.
Well, I mean, if the students like it, we're here for the students. If the students like it and they're learning something, that's what we're here for. That's what we collect our pittance of state salaries for. Oh, wait a minute. See, M. Waffer says, yeah, I just wish I could ask questions using video audio instead of the chat box. I agree, M. Waffer. Waffer thin, but when you have 10, 20, 30, 50, 500, or 5,000 users, we have experimented with that in the past, and it becomes literal chaos. So if all of you were allowed to do video chat, it would be a cacophony of craziness where actually nobody could hear anybody. And you all know how even as good as technology has gotten and stream volume has gotten for bandwidth, if 500 people are all live, if somebody like sneezes, it cuts off the audio for everything else. So I concur, M. Waffer. I actually would love to see you and hear you ask the question, but we're not there technologically yet. But we'll probably figure out a way to do it. That maybe you could, I don't know if Twitch can do this yet, but you could record a you could record yourself asking question audio and submit it, and then I could click on it when I want to. Katie, can we do that yet? See, I'm just inventing the future as we're talking. I assume that you can probably do that, and if not, you soon will, because I actually would prefer to be able to see you and be like, I'm going to click on them and they can ask the question. I would prefer that, but I also do respect people's privacy. So I think, M. Waffer, I think a lot of folks actually want to be anonymous. So whereas you, much like me, are fine with putting a video out there and having your own voice and face, I think a lot of people are not as comfortable with that, which is a sentiment I totally understand in the modern age with deep fake outs now and the future of fake facts, and real facts are even fake facts. And you applied for a job, but they found a video of you drinking a beer 20 years ago. I totally get it. I mean, if I was a student, I would be a huge Luddite. I wouldn't be on any of this stuff. What just happened here?
Only here for the podcast, just
Gifted.
5 subs.
So what does that mean? So Katie has to explain this to me. So only here for the podcast, whom we love, gave a gift of tier 1 to Ethan Owens, gave a gift to Ivan Lintikon. What the hell is that?
They're getting close to a hype train, so like if you cheer, we're getting close to like.
What the hell's a hype train? See, now you understand how this really works.
Gaming things.
So they're gaming within the system. They're gaming and doing stuff and giving stuff to each other, and that's kind of why we like the Twitch thing, because if it's simply me lecturing live, which we used to do, it's not exactly the same. And Zoom just sucks because we all agree Zoom sucks. So everybody's over Zoom, even though it had more of an interactive component that all viewers could be streaming live, but it was chaotic. It was too chaotic, and people's dogs were barking and people, farting and cutting off audio for other people. That wasn't the right way. We feel like this is a really good balance.
You should introduce who you're talking to. You're up for it.
If you're up for it, you can come introduce yourself. All right. Come. We don't know. I don't know if you all know this good gentleman, but I'll let him introduce him. Maybe you've already had a class with him.
Hey, I'm Stefan Duma. I'm a professor of engineering here, and I'm trying to learn from the expert on how to do this. So I appreciate you letting me watch your class for a little bit.
But what are the classes you teach that are super popular as World Regents?
We teach concussion perspectives. So if you've ever played a sport or had a head injury, we talk about brain injuries and recovery and all different sports and all different factors. So if you haven't taken it, it's BMES 2004. And it might look like this in a year.
Yeah. But I have been meaning to ask you actually all day since we've been talking. What do you feel like the classes that you're teaching that have become very popular, they seem very specific to me. I mean, it's about a very unique, brain injury and helmet stuff. That seems very specific. Why do you think so many people want to take these classes?
Well, I think everybody's been hit in the head. At the end of the day, we can all relate to that, right? You've played a sport, you've fallen down,
this guy.
And we're all curious now. There's so much in the media. We just had the Super Bowl last night. There's so much hype about CTE and long-term brain injuries and what's going to happen to me. Everyone who played high school sports or is a collegiate sports fan, you're dealing with concussions and you're dealing with how much is too much. How much do I play? How much do I not play? And we try to really calm that down a little bit. And I joke and I say, look, everybody's been hit in the head. And 99% of us turn out fine. We just got to figure out what those other risk factors are that we have to be careful of. And that's really where the science is right now.
Okay. Have any of you taken this guy's class? Or if not, you're going to, because it's brilliant. Oh, what happened? We just went out of focus, but I'm sure it's because there's two of us in here that are moving at different levels. Well, thank you. Thank you,
thanks
Doctor.
for your time. Really nice to see
God,
this.
absolutely.
Good luck with your class.
Oh yeah, and enjoy the wine. You need to task Curtis. Take him to the wall. Order more stuff. Order more stuff and give it away to other people in the bar.
To go.
Yes.
To go cases.
I'm telling you, he's making too much money off you. Make him spend that money.
It's really nice to meet you.
Great meeting you. I've had a delight talking to you all day today.
It's been great.
Yeah.
I'm going to get this thing going. Sorry.
Oh, what happened?
The app turned off for some reason. The one that's doing the control.
But we're still streaming live right now?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm trying to fix it.
All right. Well, Katie's trying to fix stuff. I can start talking. I don't know if the chat room will still pop up. But now that we're getting back on track, were there any questions about anything in class content or class assignments, life in general? Is there anything that's happened on planet Earth since last Monday you'd like me to touch upon before we get back to the Putin lecture? And by the way, the Putin lecture tonight, for you folks who are actually in class, will likely mostly focus on Cold War stuff. But we may not even get past the second slide. We didn't last week. And what is it you're trying to fix?
I got it now.
I was going to say, what's not working? Everything
This
looks
program
fine.
wasn't running, so it was the focus.
Oh, the focus thing, the autofocus. Gotcha. So if there's no other questions about anything, I will go back to the presentation mode, which I think I've just done. And where we left off, I think, and you all can tell me I'm wrong. By the way, thank you so much, Only Here for the Plaidcast, for all the gifts you just gave out to everybody. You're way too kind. You're awesome. And where we left off exactly 1 week ago today, well, we ended up talking about all kinds of crazy current events in the Chinese spy balloon, which, by the way, look how many more balloons have been spotted since a week ago. So it's balloon mania on planet Earth, and me and the plaid artist, we call him Plaid Klaus, the one who's done all of the illustrations for the Plaid Adventure for 15 years. Me and Klaus were talking, and we think the cover of the 12th edition of the textbook might be Balloon Mania. For the 12th edition, I think it's either going to be something about balloons, or since it's the 12th edition of the textbook, and 12 is a dozen, it might be the Dirty Dozen Dictators on planet Earth. I can't decide which way to go. By all means, you guys can chime in the chat room of, should the 12th edition of the textbook focus on balloon mania on planet Earth? Balloon wars. Let's call them balloon wars. Or should it focus on the Dirty Dozen Dictators currently controlling the vast majority of humans on planet Earth? M. Waffer immediately chimes in with Dirty Dozen Dictators. Thank you for your vote, M. Waffer. Okay, so where we left off last week, Vikram Tiwari in the Hizzle, welcome back, Vikram, says, what do you think the consequences of those apparent spy balloons U.S. military has been shooting down? Brighton says BTW. Is that Balloon Wars? By the way, no, it's a BTD. BTD. What does the BTD stand for, Brighton? Sorry. Vikram is following up with, does this mean war in China or China planning on taking over Taiwan? Well, China has every plan on taking over Taiwan. Balloon Tower Defense. Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for that, Brighton. The balloon wars that are suddenly unfolding, I think it's too early to call. It 100% is going to affect U.S.-Chinese relationships, and I say that because it 100% already has affected U.S.-Chinese relations. And so it's not going to be any big stretch of the imagination that relations between the two countries are going to get worse because of this newfound Back to the Future, going back in time, balloon spy technology, which, by the way, I don't even know why I know this, it was first used in the U.S. Civil War. How do I know this and why? I don't even know the details, but for some reason I'm 100% certain that the first balloon reconnaissance for wartime efforts was during the U.S. Civil War, where I think it was the North that floated something over a wartime scenario or wartime area of the South at a battlefield to take pictures or gauge what was going on. I don't know why I know this. So bizarre, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Okay, but the U.S.-Chinese relations are certainly going to get worse because of the balloon wars, but beyond that, it's too early to call. Beware of any pundit or anybody on TV or the interwebs who starts waxing poetically that they're going to predict what's going to happen in the next 2, 5, 10, or 20 years. Because once you get past 2 weeks from now, nobody really knows, and you're full of shit if you pretend like you really do. You're just guessing. So I try to teach people enough to understand events as they unfold, and I will even not throw out predictions, but throw out likely scenarios. Like, this is likely to happen, which is why I can say with some confidence, this is likely to really negatively impact U.S.-Chinese relations. Beyond that, you can't predict a war over balloons. That's preposterous. We don't know that yet. It's got to get way worse, and we have no idea really what's even going on yet. But we do apparently are entering the balloon war age. It's just comical to talk about it, balloon wars. And M. Offer says, why is China doing this exactly? Kind of seems like they're intentionally making relations worse. That might be the Only Here for the Podcast is already calling me out on the carpet, saying apparently the first was France at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. Well, that was before the U.S. Civil War, so I stand corrected. Only Here for the Podcast. Back to M. Waffer, who says, why is China doing this? Kind of seems like they're making things inflammatory, perhaps on purpose. That's a whole nother plaid cast or Twitch cast, because this... I'm only going to say this, then I'm moving on to Putin because we're already getting behind in time. There's more than is going on at the face of this whole balloon fiasco with China. And what I mean by that is, I think we're at 99% certainty that these are Chinese balloons. And I'd say I'm 95% at certainty that they are spy balloons. China denies both of these things, by the way, but I'm not saying I just believe what my government says, because I don't. I don't believe the U.S. government either. But it seems exceptionally likely, and given the interactions and given the information that's being collected on the ones shot down, it does appear that these are Chinese spy balloons. So once you accept that, then you have to start asking questions. Why are they doing it? What data are they collecting? Which I still think remains to be seen. But your question, M. Waffer, is, are they just doing this intentionally? And that speaks to another issue that perhaps we can do a podcast on later in this week, maybe next week, because I'm really busy this week with Valentine's Day. But this does show a bit of a fracture within the Chinese power complex. And so there is a lot of international chatter with pundits and specialists that if this indeed are Chinese spy balloons, they very likely were sent out by some military folks without the express consent of dear great leader Xi Jinping. And that exposes a whole nother level of intricacy and complication here. Because Xi, the president of China, by all bets would not have done this, ordered this to be done on his behalf, and likely would have said, no, let's not do this right now. So you might be witnessing a power fracture and a bit of an internal power play between Xi Jinping and the military. And a lot of folks are talking about that. That does not mean it's true. But I do like the concept of that, of maybe no one can really explain this, and the Chinese government actually feels like it's struggling to explain these things, which means they're not all on the same wavelength. Within the Chinese government, there is some lack of communications that are occurring, which is why they're falling on flat feet. If you guys remember, a week ago, the Chinese government was saying, "Oh, that's not our balloon. I mean, it is our balloon. Oh, it's not our balloon. Oh, it's a private balloon. It's a meteorological balloon. It's not collecting spy data. The U.S. is a joke." And a whole 7 days later, that story's already gone away. They're not even trying that bullshit. So something is going on here that the Chinese government's not fully in control of. Okay? And Jessica Coca says, Putin, what a great topic. Boom, back to point. Thank you, Jessica. Let's talk about Putin. Let's talk about Russia. Let's talk about the Cold War. Let's talk about why Russia under Putin decided to reinvade Ukraine. And I do stress reinvade Ukraine. Thank you, Jessica, for getting us back on track. So when we left off last week, we were talking about how Putin is the new czar. He's reestablished the czardom of Russia after its brief flirtation of a decade or so as a democracy. He has reestablished himself as the leader of a fake democracy where he is the king, he is the czar, he is the Caesar. He has all power. He's not going anywhere. They don't even need to conduct elections anymore. I mean, they will, so they can pretend like they're a democracy, but he can't lose. He can't lose partially, as we were summing up last week, because he still holds tremendous public popularity. Not as much as it was, but he still at least holds 50% approval rating, maybe 60, maybe 70. But it used to be 90. So he is still wildly popular at home to the majority, and if it's not the majority, it's a big minority, but let's call it a majority. He also holds all the keys to all the power. He controls all the press. He controls all the communications. He controls the entire government. He controls the entire military. Nobody can argue with him. Nobody's going to argue with him. So he cannot lose an election, so they don't even need to have elections. I also was saying how he's the Slavic savior, because he has defined himself as a leader of Slavic culture, of Slavic principle, of the great Slavic, tradition, or the Slavic empire that is neither east nor west. That is, Russia does not want to be part of the EU, doesn't want to be part of Europe, and is not necessarily Eastern either. They're not China, although they have more economic and political relations with China right now, but they're still kind of distant from China. So Putin's Russia has always been cast in his own kind of a mold as not East, not West. We're Russia. We're unique. We're separate. We're a superpower in our own right. We're awesome. We are the leader of the Slavs, and that includes Slavs in Ukraine and perhaps Belarus and perhaps other countries in Eastern Europe. Does that sound about where we left off? I hope so, because we're going to keep going unless somebody has a question. So I was finishing up with he's a living legend. He's a Slavic savior. How in the heck did this guy, here it is, the year 2023. This guy has been in power for 24 years. It's easy to remember. 2023, came to power in 1999. He's been in power, whatever the year is, he's been in power +1. So to understand this current Putin cult of personality, you have to put it in context of Russian history, at least the history that Vladimir Putin himself understands and pays attention to. And we referenced this last week too. I just referenced. I'm not going to go into the whole Russian lecture. I would love to give you a whole Russian lecture this semester, but it'll be probably 5 Mondays in a row, if not 6. So I'm just touching upon early Russian history, Kievan Rus, the kind of first, and it's called Kievan. Kiev is the capital of modern-day Ukraine. Kievan Rus. Rus, you mean like Russian? Rus? Yes. So the Russian Empire, if you want to call it that, or kingdom, actually started in what's now parts of modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Eastern Europe, and parts of modern-day Russia. But it wasn't the Russia we see today that spans the entire Eurasian continent. And so that's why it's appropriate to talk about Putin as a Slavic savior in his own brain, because the original Russian state was based not on Russian people, but on Slavic people that are the peoples that now are within Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and some other places. All right? But what you need to understand, I'll go back one slide real quick. Look at that big pink blob, all right? You with me? That was a nebulous, not really defendable, not like there's a fence around this. The first Kievan Rus is mostly about where Slavic people are that started to unify around a singular leader, that one being Oleg the Great, Prince Oleg. And so what a lot of folks don't understand, I forgot to move the curtains. What a lot of folks don't understand about the old world, and by that I mean not Europe, but olden times, is that we now call them nation states or sovereign states. I forgot to push up all the curtains. But that's not really how humans used to organize themselves. 1,000 years ago, and certainly in 880, it wasn't that people were saying, hey, we have these borders, and these borders around our area called Rus, or our area, we're drawing lines, and our territory is here, and everybody else outside of there is not us, and we're the Kievan Rus here. Even France, by the way, I know you don't know much Russian history, so you don't perhaps can relate to this nebulous pink blob. But even what you call France, 1,000 years ago, you didn't have the state of France with borders around it. what you had in both France and Kievan Rus is that these are humans. These are humans that had some cultural homogeneity. They had something in common. They saw themselves as part of a greater tribe, let's call it. And they had leaders. And it was about the people and their leader much more than it was about the borders or the land, because people can move. And people did move all the time. So it wasn't that we own this land. Kievan Rus says we are this people who happen to be on this land. And even France was, we are the French people with a French king who happen to be roughly in this area that 1,000 years later we call France. But you need to understand that. There's no hard borders here. And the reason it's important to understand that for Russian history is they weren't even that important 1,000 years ago. The Kievan Rus was a group of people that did move around because sometimes they were moving around to run the hell away from this group of people, which is the Mongols. And Genghis Khan and his Mongol Empire, which he built out of Central Asia and fringe now East Asia, modern day China, were the real power in this part of the world from, say, 1,000 onwards. And certainly about 1,200 when Genghis Khan and his funky bunch of the horde, the Mongol horde, started building a big empire that again was based on the humans, not so much the territory, but they started taking over territory. So the Mongol horde, led by Genghis Khan, swept from what's now Mongolia, northern China, to take over all of what is like modern China, all of the modern Koreas, all of modern Central Asia, infiltrated into what's now India, took over modern day Iran, took over what was at the time the Arab Caliphate, which was centered in Baghdad. So it took over the Middle East, and yes, indeed, took over what is now parts of Western Russia, including pushing that fringe of Kievan Rus to where they were. So the horde, the Mongol horde, was the real power in this part of planet Earth. Kievan Rus was hanging on for dear life as a group of Slavic folks hanging out in Eastern Europe that were trying to just not get the shit kicked out of them by the Mongols. Does that make sense? So 1,000 years ago, let's just call it 800 years ago now, what we could call the Russian people were a fringe group of humans next door to the actual power players of the age, which were the Mongols. And all of Europe, by the way, was terrified with the Mongols sweeping through and taking over all of the European territory and European tribes who were on these lands. Because everybody watched Baghdad get sacked in 1258 by the Mongols. Baghdad, by the way, in 1258 was the epicenter of the Muslim world and one of the baddest ass and biggest cities of the ancient world, not the ancient world, the medieval world at the time. Center of learning, center of power. The Islamic Empire had grown significantly in the 500 years prior to the Mongols showing up and had taken over North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, even Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. So Europe was a kind of a fringe, and the Russian peoples were a fringe of a fringe that were stuck between the Europeans and the Mongol horde pushing up against them. Is everybody with me so far? Can I get a shout out and an amen in the chat room? Because I need you to understand that as we move forward to understand modern Russia. So Vladimir Putin knows his history. This is a lecture about Putin, by the way. It's about Putin's mindset. So Vladimir Putin knows his history, and he knows this history. But this is a history of kind of pre-Russia in his mind. This is where history starts for Vladimir Putin. And it starts here because this is when the tide turns. So Mongol Empire at the death of Genghis Khan is what you're seeing now in green here, or actually Kublai Khan in 1294. So call it like 1300. By 1300, all of Eurasia, the biggest chunk of Eurasia, is controlled by this group. And this group called the Russian people, R.I.P. Genghis, says M. Woffer. Thank you for that, M. Woffer. The Russian people at this time are, again, a fringe group of humans hanging out what's now Eastern Europe, around Kiev and Eastern. They're not even in Moscow yet. But this is when history starts to change. So the growth of the empire, 1300, this is when Vladimir Putin's mind kicks in, and I would say the average Russian would say this is when our history starts. We were a group of humans before this. And this is when we start to rise as a serious kingdom / empire / power. 1300 is the pivotal year. Because 1300 is Kiev got crushed, makes Oleg sad, all right? So the Kievan Rus was under the authority of the Mongol Empire. They were an enclave, if you were, a puppet state, a subsidiary, a vassal state. Any of these terms that you recognize apply to what Russia was to Genghis Khan in 1300. However, and you're going to see also that by 1300, the Russians had moved away from Kiev and the open plains of Eastern Europe, and many of them had moved to Moscow. Why Moscow? It's actually harder to get to. It's between rivers. It's swampy. It's forested. So during this age of Mongol conquest, a lot of what we would now call ethnically Russian people retreated northward and into the interior of a much harder place to get to. Forested areas are not the forte of the Mongol horde. They dominate open plains because they were horsemen. Anybody know about the Mongols? They were wicked kick-ass horsemen. They literally ruled the world because they were so badass at warfare on horses. But you can only do warfare on horses in open plains. You can't pull that shit off in a forest, which is why many ethnic Russians started to move towards a fortress, a forest fortress, as it were, in a slightly harder to get to area that's semi-swamp and rivers run through it and it's forested. And they're going to settle in a place we'll eventually call it, I don't know, Moscow. Again, it's mostly because of physical geography. They still were dominated by the Mongols, but this is a tougher place. They gave tribute to the Mongols, but they couldn't be as easily overrun and or marauded and or slaughtered by the Mongols. That's how the Russian group, which is a subsidiary of a greater Slavic group, ends up in Moscow. Cool? So 1300, we can start calling them Russian-type people, are in this area around Moscow, but look at the size of their state. It's not very big. That's going to change. Within 100 years, or 160 years, Moscow and its environs builds up enough of a population, enough military power to actually throw off Mongol rule under this guy that was Ivan the Terrible. Actually, I should have went back. Ivan the Terrible is the one that helped unify Russians, expand their kind of area, and kick out the Golden Horde, kick out the Mongols. This is the first time, 1462, that they start to become something we would refer to as an empire / free state. They are no longer a vassal to anybody, no longer a vassal to the Mongols. So they start becoming Mongolian barbecue. Brighton Y is giving a shout out to. That's some good shizzle right there, right? Ivan III sticks a fork in the taters because they're done by 1500. And so you see that once the Tartars, which are another word for the Mongols, are completely and utterly routed and their empire kind of collapses throughout Eurasia, Russia then steps up. They'd already established themselves. They'd already kind of defended their territory, and now their territory is starting to grow. Where is it starting to grow? Is it starting to grow directly in confrontation with the Mongol horde? No, it's growing northward, where the Mongol horde never really had a hold anyway. So into modern day northwestern Russia, into modern day Finland, into modern day Eastern Europe, where the Tartars / Mongols had never really taken over fully, the Russians then started to by 1500. And here's where it starts to get interesting. I actually misspoke with Ivan III. Ivan III is the one that overthrew the Tartars. I'm not going to test you on this because I've already misplaced my information. But that was Ivan the Great. I think that was Ivan the Great was Ivan III. It's not terribly important. But Ivan the Terrible is. So Ivan IV is Ivan the Terrible. And under Ivan the Terrible, he truly was terrible, killed his own son, bludgeoned his own son to death. That's why he's gotten the title of Terrible. But he also was a fairly violent human being. And in that, he decided to beat the shit out of everybody on his borders. So Ivan the Terrible expanded the empire now further north, east, northwest, but also south. So now you're seeing areas starting to be taken over. And if you look at that map closely, you see even parts of modern day Ukraine started to be intruded upon or expanded into by 1600. And now we're going to fast forward a lot through history because, again, if you want a whole lecture on Russian history and Russia in the modern age, I can do it, but I'll go into much more detail. So I'm going quickly here. And so the quick jump is for the next 200 years after Ivan the Terrible, the fourth, Ivan the Terrible, Russian conquest and expansion just continues. It's not like continuous and it's not like easy, but that's why I fast forwarded. There's too many sub stories here to go into detail. All you really need to know is that under Michael I, which is the first of the House of Romanov, and by 1600, 1613, he's the first of the House of Romanov. Why is that important? Because the House of Romanov, that is a single family dynasty, they're the ones that are in power all the way up to the bitter end till Tsar Nicholas II, when he gets assassinated. He's the last of the House of Romanovs. So we have a single family lineage that starts in 1613 in Russia. That's rulers of Russia for 300 years, almost exactly 300 years of a single family dominance. And under that family dominance, you've heard of people, you have probably never heard of Michael I, but you probably have heard of Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725, that expanded westward. He actually wanted wanted Russia to be much more European, and he dressed like Europeans and made his army more like a European army and adopted modern Western technologies and military strategies and shipbuilding exercises and printing press technologies. He was a very westward thinking leader. Catherine the Great is another famous Russian leader you've heard of that also grew the empire. Both Peter and Catherine actually went east. Peter was more focused on moving west towards Russia, but both of them expanded in both directions, and Catherine grew it even more to the east. So you see, if you just go back one slide, 1600 and 200 years later, watch this growth. I mean, they really take over large chunks of what we call Eurasia in a 200-year period of virtually unabated growth. They didn't really ever lose anything. They just kind of went in stages where certain leaders wanted to grab more, and they did. And so eastward ho, and for 200 years, for those of you that know your history, even American history, you know that I could actually expand this, that the Russians expanded across the Bering Strait and actually owned Alaska. What's now modern day Alaska was taken over by Russian explorers and the Russian military back in the 1800s. And in fact, the Russians had made it as far south on the west coast of the United States as San Francisco by 1812. It's actually flabbergasting to think about this in hindsight of 20th century history, but this country, at least the western part of it, could just as well have been Russian. They were there the same time that the European-based powers, mostly Britain and France, were taking over North America from the east. The Russians were taking over from the west. And so it's simply a matter of historical circumstance that the Russians had so much territory, they felt like they probably shouldn't keep expanding. They couldn't keep their arms around it. And they sold Alaska and their North American holdings to the U.S. government. A move that one must think has been regretted ever since. And by the way, 5 points extra credit. What's the purchase of Alaska has a nickname. The first person in the chat room gives me the nickname of and it's a derogatory nickname of the U.S. Department of Interior Secretary who bought Alaska from Russia. What is the nickname of that purchase, which was derogatory at the time because so many people thought it was stupid that this guy spent like $2 million to buy the entirety of Alaska? Who's got it? Who's got it? Come on. Come on. Bring it on in. We don't have anything else to drink here, do we? Bam! The blind barber's got it. Seward's Folly, and actually first-time chatter from Mara Barara. I'll also give you Seward's Icebox. Both of those are great, great answers. And actually, Blind Barber, Mara Barrera, Livia W. and M. Woffer, email me right now and give your answers there and give me your real names. You all just earned 5 points each. Thank you for playing the game. Okay, so back to, by the way, we will get to Putin before we end this in 15 minutes. So the point here is that for centuries, Russia grew territorially and politically into a world power that they had not been before. They were a land power in Eastern Europe. Then they were a land power in Eurasia. Then they took over a giant chunk of the continent. They are the biggest country on planet Earth, period. They are the largest empire since the Mongolian Empire. So I could be wrong on this, and it doesn't really matter to me, but my instinct has always been that the largest contiguous world empire ever was the Mongols, and that second place is the Russians. I could be wrong, doesn't really matter. We go back to the Roman Empire or even Alexander the Great's empires. They were big, but we're talking square footage here. These are big, big empires. Okay? However, what's going on in Russia this entire time I'm talking about from 1300, 1500, 1700, 1800, 1850? What is life like for the average Russian human being as this empire grows and takes over more and more territory and more people on that territory? Well, for Russia, the average Russian, life's not great. And I don't mean to be dismissive to Russians. I actually love Russia. I know somebody last week even said that my lecture was racist against Russians. I'm like, oh, for God's sakes. Racism doesn't even mean that. What did you mean to say, that I was being unfair or unkind to Russians? Racism is not the right term. It has nothing to do with the color of skin. Were you suggesting that I was being unfair to this ethnic group, or that you didn't like what I said about this ethnic group? Quite frankly, it doesn't matter to me, but for God's sakes, get your terms right. So for the average Russian, and this is where I was going with this might be offensive to say, but life has been hard for the average Russian. It was 500 years ago, and this is the offensive part. I think it might still be hard for them today. I think the average Russian in today's Russia is probably not living out their best life, is probably not making as much money as they should, is probably not getting as many freedoms as they should, is probably not making as much money or have access to resources as they should, because the Russian people are a highly literate people, a highly technologically advanced people. And it's simply a matter of they've had different ruling systems which have just not given the average Russian person their fair shake. That's all I'll say about that. I love the Russian people. I think they deserve more than most of their leaders have given them. But if we go back 500 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 100 years ago, or yesterday, Russian life is pretty hard for the average person. It's a cold place. It's a bitterly cold place. It's a hard life. Most of the people are what we call peasants in today's world. In fact, they called them serfs, which means you don't have rights as a citizen. You're actually tied to the land. It's a very fine line between a serf and a slave. A slave, particularly for the American experience or the African experience, is someone taken from their land that is treated as property, not as a human, and they are taken from their land and treated as property so that the owner can get free labor. Serfs are a variant of that, and they're only a variant in that they're not taken from a place and taken for their labor. They're considered property in the place they were born and live. So it's more of, we are currently, for those of you here in town, we're currently in Montgomery County in the state of Virginia. And serfdom would be 500 years ago, or even 200 years ago, is more that you were born here in Montgomery County, and there's a duke that owns Montgomery County, and since you were born here, you're tied to the land of Montgomery County, as is your entire family, and you owe him money because you live here. And so you're kind of property, but you're property that's tied to the land. And you're mostly peasants in terms of you're agriculturalist. So you don't own your own property. And whatever crops you grow, you owe the duke half your crop, and he allows you to live on his land. Does that make sense? By the way, slave, serf, both of them suck. There is no winner here, but it is a slightly different system that I need you to understand, because this goes on in Russia for a very long time. So the slave trade started to be challenged in the late 1700s. The U.S., of course, has a very long history of horrible race relations because the founding fathers couldn't figure out how to deal with the slave issue. But they were talking about it in the 1700s, and it largely became outlawed by Great Britain and other countries in the 1800s. But in Russia, you pretty much had the same serfdom situation where you were a product, your property tied to the land. And by the way, you don't have rights to travel. You obviously have no rights to vote. You have no property ownership rights. And whatever duke or lord owned the territory that you were tied to, that was the judge and juror. And so that owner could come in and be like, hey, by the way, I'm going to take your wife or your youngest daughter, and I'm going to do whatever I want to with her. And you had no rights. You had no recourse. None. And if you got into a fight with your neighbor, and you say your neighbor stole a pig or raped your wife, and you went and attacked them, you didn't take, there was no law. You didn't take that to the local police. The landowner would come and decide which one of you is right or wrong, and they might kill one of you, whoever he thought was personally guilty. So it's a very different world that I'm trying to describe to you here. And it's not great. And even though these are people that are ethnically Russians, by the way, that's the other difference between being a slave, especially in the North Atlantic in the Americas slave trade, is that you are from another continent. And that made it much easier for the Europeans and the Americans to say, like, well, you're not really a human because you're not from here and you don't look like us, which again is horrible. I'm not saying it's a better system. I'm saying just think about the differences in Russian serfdom. These are people that are owned by the same ethnic group that they belong to. It's kind of, I don't know. Again, there's no clear winner here in which one sucked worse, slavery or serfdom. They both really suck. But there's an added dimension in the Russian world that you do need to understand, that serfdom was a part of their history for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that is that they were used to or accommodated to being owned and controlled by people of their own ethnicity, of their own race. They weren't other people that were brought here. They were owned and controlled by people in their same group. Again, why am I stressing this? I actually don't know, but I think it's important to understand that, to understand the Russian mindset, that even in today's world, they're okay with a Vladimir Putin perhaps making their lives horrible because they've been conditioned for it, because they're all part of this tribe that for centuries, it actually used to be worse somehow. I know. I'm not making a lot of sense here, but if this makes any sense to you and you kind of get the point I'm making, please, again, give me a shout out in the chat room. I saw Brighton already gave me a truth, and M. Offer said, were people held in the Gulag serfs for the forced labor they had to do? No. M. Offer, Gulag is an entirely different thing that also occurred during this era, but occurred much more later. And Gulag is more like punishment, more like you've been sentenced to, you're sentenced for treason or sentenced to murder, and so you're going to go to this other place that's punishment, where you are 100% forced labor, working in a mine, being starved to death. That's Gulag. That's different. A lot of political prisoners end up in Gulag during the Soviet era that we haven't even got to yet, but it's different than serfdom is, hey, I'm just living in Blacksburg in Montgomery County in Virginia, and there are people that own me and own my labor simply because of where I'm at. Does that make sense? Bivash is in the house saying that makes sense. I never knew this. I mean, I lecture on instinct, and so there's no way for me to even kind of quantify this and point to a study that says this. But the way that I understand, I try to understand why is the average Russian, even in today's world, really look up to, say, Joseph Stalin, who from the outside looks like a butcher. I mean, in all history books except Russian history books, this is a super bad guy. But he's widely admired by the Russians. And Vladimir Putin is now joining his ranks of, he looks like he's out killing lots of innocent Ukrainian humans, but he's looked upon as the Slavic savior and a good guy by Russians. And I think it really has a lot to do with hundreds of years of a system that kind of ingrained that these are people like you who just happen to be in charge. And don't question them. They're here fighting on your behalf. The Duke or Lord of your territory 500 years ago, that's your daddy. And he's a Russian like you are, and he's in charge, and don't worry about it. I kind of instinctually believe a lot of that for hundreds and hundreds of years has played through the Russian psyche into the modern era of Vladimir Putin's Russia, which is daddy's in charge, and he's a Russian like you. You should support him and be proud of him because he's looking out for you. Maybe that makes more sense, or maybe it's offensive. I don't know. I actually want Russian people to chime in, but Russian people aren't allowed to watch this because Daddy doesn't allow his people he takes care of to look at Western news. First time chatter from Vetza7. Thank you for chatting, Vetza. Says, can Americans go become Russian citizens right now? Oh my God. Oh, absolutely. Oh yeah. It would be an incredible propaganda coup if any of you all went and applied for Russian citizenships. They would probably fly you there. They would probably buy you the plane ticket because it's a great propaganda tool for the Russian president or Russian leadership to be like, look how horrible America is. They're despicable. They're liars. They're threatening the world. They're threatening the world, the whole Cold War. They're threatening Russia's existence right now. And it's so bad. By the way, you can get the best news about hate crimes in America and the wealth disparity gap in America and Black Lives Matters. The best coverage you'll get of that is Russian news. And I'm not being facetious. They cover that stuff extensively for their own people. So they can say, hey, look how bad America is. I mean, they just had 5 police officers beat to death a black person. I mean, how bad is America? And again, for those of us living in America, it don't look good, does it? But it's great propaganda for the Russian state machine to say, look how bad this country is. And if any of you all were to want to defect to Russia, that would be a boon. It would be a huge political propaganda thing. They'd be like, look, America's so bad, people want to leave there and come to Russia. So I think you could probably get a free plane ticket. I'm not suggesting it, Vetsa7, unless you speak Russian and really adore Russian culture. It might be a challenging thing, but let's get back to the lecture to talk about why it's challenging. So, 1861. Put this in context. 1861 is when the U.S. Civil War started. And when the U.S. Civil War started, serfdom was still in place in Russia, meaning when you were born, you were still tied to a plot of land and considered as semi-property. 1861? Yeah, it's way late. The Atlantic slave trade was already gone. Slavery period was already outlawed in Europe and supposedly outlawed in America, but that's why we have a civil war, because we hadn't figured that shit out yet. But it's still kind of happening in Russia. And even after they finally said in the Russian constitution, they said, no, there's no more serfdom. The practice still happened because old habits die hard. The practice was still happening up until the 1900s. I mean, that's getting very modern. I know you guys are born in the 21st century, so you're like, that's 100 years ago. It's not that long ago that people were still serfs in Russia, like 100 years. So you also have a serfdom situation that goes very late into modern history in Russia. You have Romanov rule, which is an old school way of rule that's not democratic. It's old school structured. It's dynastic. It's successional. It's a right-wing form of government. The people have no voice at all. And that they had kings or czars up till 1917. So at the same time, America had a revolution, had become a democracy. The French Revolution occurred. All European states moved to democracy. Russia is still led by a czar, right up until the end of World War I. So everything I'm talking about is playing into this kind of idea that Russia, coming into the modern age of the last 100 years, is a really stagnant society. It's feudal, monarchical. People don't have rights. They don't have a voice. It's technologically stagnant. They're way behind militarily, technologically, economically. I mean, they're a poor state. They're poor because they're mostly agricultural based. They've not joined even the Industrial Revolution that was happening in the rest of Europe. So at the dawn of the 20th century, that's like 1901, this is a state that's really far behind. It's kind of a backwater, all right? Economically, socially, technologically, politically, a complete laggard. Complete. And it's not a great place to live. And enter into that the Russian rulers in rapid review that we'll probably only get through tonight. And that is, okay, so what happened in the 20th century of Russia? Remember, we're still painting a portrait of how we get to Vladimir Putin. And I know this is a long form, but it's what I do. I hope you all enjoy this. It's a longer story, even though it's still short compared to what I would do for just a whole Russian lecture. But you can't understand why Vladimir Putin just invaded Ukraine unless you have this backstory that I'm giving you. M. Wofford says, does the state-controlled media in Russia play a role in people thinking life is great in Russia and worse in other countries? Yes. And they won't even say life is great in Russia. They will say, if you are suffering in Russia, it's because you're a good person. We are all giving to Mother Russia. You are helping support the state. Your suffering is appreciated. We know times are hard, and that makes us stronger. Stick together. We're part of the tribe. Stick with the tribe. We're doing the right thing. And it's all the West's fault. It's all the United States' fault. It's all Team West's fault that we're suffering, and you should hate them, and that should be the rallying cry that you understand the government of Russia is here to help you and try to save you, and it's all outside forces that are making us suffer. But suffer in silence and stay unified with the state, and we will get through this. Which, by the way, I'm not even making fun of Russia. Every country would say that if they were isolated on planet Earth and felt threatened. Okay? So Russian rulers in rapid review, and I will do this rapid, and we'll pick up again here next week. AKA a century-long series of unfortunate events. They're fortunate and unfortunate simultaneously. So for starters, I've now painted this portrait of Russia as economically, technologically, politically, militarily, they're laggards. They're way behind the rest of Europe as it is colonizing planet Earth, having an industrial revolution, getting richer and taking over the world. Russia's kind of dog paddling. And then things take a turn for the worse. So Tsar Nicholas II, the last in the line of the Romanovs, as I suggested, in a 300-year continuous family rule, he's a pretty inept goober. He had already lost a war to Japan, a country no one even knew where it was in 1905, when Russia lost to them, and the entire Russian fleet was sank by the Japanese. Huge embarrassment. Then he entered World War I on advice from the guy you see in the smaller picture, which is this dude called Rasputin. Does anybody know Rasputin? Anybody give me a shout in the chat room you've heard of Rasputin. He was a real dude, a total con artist, crazy mofo. And Rasputin was a religious healer who had the ear of the king, ear of the czar and the czarist empress. They trusted him implicitly. They followed his advice, even though he was a 6.5 foot tall Herman Munster, crazy, sex-crazed, sex-addled, drug-addled dude. But he had convinced them that he could speak to God. So on advice from God, Rasputin told Tsar Nicholas not only should he enter World War I when the Russians did not need to, but that God told him that, Tsar Nicholas, you should actually lead the troops from the front lines of World War I. Mostly so Rasputin could stay behind in the palace and have sex with everybody he wanted to and drink the cellars dry. So this dude single-handedly, and by the way, I'm skipping over a ton of Russian history. So also, as Tsar Nicholas II is losing World War I, he's already lost a fight with Japan. He's losing World War I to the Hessians, the Germans, whatever they're called at the time. He's losing territory. They're losing on the front line. They're losing men. It's a complete and utter rout of a war from the Russian perspective. They just lose and lose and lose. And all at the same time, people are getting more and more unhappy. And this is when you have a protest where people start going and holding picket signs in front of the Winter Palace. And Tsar Nicholas II tells the military, just gun them down. Just gun down civilians. I mean, there's nothing good about this guy's rule. He might have personally been a delight of a human, but his rule was an utter disaster for Russia, and it just pisses off more and more and more people. And if you're looking at the dates here, 1917, they got out of World War I. They said, you know what? We're losing. We've lost territory. Keep it. We're out. Because what else happened in 1917? I bet you know. This whole thing called a kind of communist revolution, because people are so unhappy. They want this guy overthrown. And so in 1917, he abdicated the throne. But he mostly oversaw the Russian Empire go from being one of the foremost great powers of Eurasia to being on the brink of utter collapse from the inside out. Luckily, things then take a turn for the worse, because then what happens, because of this dissent, because of this unhappiness, because of the protest, because of the counter-protest by the government who are killing and crushing their own citizens while they're losing World War I and losing citizens who are dying in World War I, all of this foments this dude you've heard of called Vladimir Lenin. He's the commie guy. And he came up and said, by the way, he spent time in Gulag. Whoever asked that question. Because his brother, I think it was his brother, tried to assassinate the Tsar, and so his brother was sent to Gulag, and he stuck up for, or his brother was hung, and that made Vladimir Lenin more an outspoken political person, and then he got sentenced to Gulag for his political views, if memory serves. I'm not going to ask you any of these things on a test, but I believe he got thrown out of the country, so he spent most of his time, Vladimir Lenin, spent most of his time in either Switzerland or somewhere in Europe doing most of his writing. And most of his writing was about, we need to overthrow this government. They suck. And so because Tsar Nicholas II was so terrible and Rasputin wasn't much better, and everything was failing for the Russian Tsarist community, this is what helped push Vladimir Lenin into power, or at least opened up a doorway for this guy. His actions and speaking engagements, because he was a very powerful speaker, sparked the Civil War. He's the one that led the Communist Revolution that overtook the Russian, called the Congress, in a semi-revolution that became a bigger revolution. And so not everyone in Russia wanted to become communist, by the way, but through political manipulations, the Communist Party ended up taking over all power and consolidating power very rapidly in a very smart move. So there were people in Russia, by the way, and this is often overlooked, that wanted to become a democracy. They're like, look, this is what's happening over in Europe. You know, we could even be a constitutional monarchy, for God's sakes, like Great Britain or Spain. I mean, they kept the ruler, but they started to democratize. And so there were people all over the place that were like, well, we should do this. We should be a constitutional monarchy, or we should be a full-fledged democracy, or we should do this. Only some people wanted to be communist because it hadn't been tried before. The whole communist experience is new. And Russia is the first place it was experimented with wholesale. So they were a minority. But because of political maneuvers, they ended up consolidating power very quickly and took over the place in what we now refer to as the Communist Revolution. Unfortunately, and then things took a turn for the worse because he died. And I say that's a turn for the worse because for all of his faults, and there were plenty, including the ideology itself, Vladimir Lenin actually was a purist is not the right word, but he actually wanted to help Russia. And he actually, in his heart of hearts, thought that communism was the way to help Russia. And while we can disagree with this philosophically or ideologically, and in hindsight of history, we can say we were right and you were wrong. At the time, he was trying to do something good for his country. He was a nationalist. He wanted Russia to stand back up and be proud after a half a century of humiliation. But then he died. And then things took a turn for the worse, because the guy that took over for him is one Joseph Stalin. And this is where we kick off in the 1920s. Well, I call it Ballin' with Stalin. And Stalin may or may not have been that dedicated to the communist cause. He may or may not have had restoration of Russian national glory as his number one priority. In hindsight of history, it looks like Joseph Stalin was mostly about Joseph Stalin. He kind of was what we call a 100% dictator, strongman in charge from 1924 to 1953. So you're looking at 25 plus solid years, quarter century. He kind of was a psychopath. And this is where I will now start to get offensive to Russians personally, or those real academics of Russian history, because that is a strong word, calling a leader a psychopath, particularly because so many Russians in today's world still vote him as their favorite leader throughout all their history. But from the outside, he sure looks like a psychopath. He killed a lot of Russian people, and he did consolidate all power to himself, and he was paranoid as shit, which is why he killed so many Russians. So he did something called the Red Terror, which was like a secret police, which instilled fear in his own Russian population to basically scare people into snitching on their neighbors and anybody you thought was an enemy of the state, and tell our secret purge unit who you don't like that doesn't love Joseph Stalin enough, and we'll have them killed, and we'll kill them, and we'll kill their family, and we'll kill their pets, and we'll kill their livestock, and we'll kill their next of kin, and we'll kill their neighbors just for good measure. I mean, this is some pretty scary shit. And so from the outside, it's hard to not call him a psychopath. He's the one that started mass deportations, the mass gulag system we've referred to earlier. He created what we now call the KGB, which is the secret police. He forced millions of people to randomly relocate. So he would go down to a place like, not Armenia, but Azerbaijan, which was part of the Soviet Empire, and be like, well, there's too many ethnic Azerbaijanis here, and we don't want them to get too separate if they want to become their own state. So we're going to take 90% of the ethnic Azerbaijanis and move them to almost North Korea. And then we're going to move a bunch of ethnic Georgians, and we're going to move them to Finland. And then we're going to the Chechens were mass migrated by force to all parts of the Soviet Empire. And by the way, now we're calling this the Soviet Empire. 1917 is the Communist Revolution. We don't refer to it as Russia anymore. We're going to call it the Soviet Union now. But the same person who labeled me as a racist last week for being dismissive of Russian culture also said, well, you're a racist because you don't understand history, because the Russians had no power in the Soviet Union. And that's when I knew this person was just a troll crank. Because what you need to understand, and I want you to understand because I want you to be smart, not because I'm telling my personal opinion. The Russian, ethnic Russian people, Russia was the biggest state, obviously. I've already showed you a picture of how big it was. But when they turned into the USSR, they started to make sub-states. So they pulled in the Chechen Soviet Socialist Republic and the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic and the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. And those republics were based on ethnicity. But make no bones about it, the Russian ethnic group, Mother Russia, Big Russia, that was the vast majority of the population. And 100%, and you can dispute me, but you're going to have evidence, 100% the ethnic Russians, as the majority ethnicity, controlled the Soviet Union. Now, they integrated other ethnicities. But make no bones about it, the ethnic Russians maintained virtually all control over the Soviet system. You can call it Russia, you can call it the Soviet Union, but Russia is kind of calling the shots really all the way to the bitter end. How can I prove that? We could wait and get to that story, but we're already so over time. I'm going to flash forward to it. When Great Soviet Union collapses in 1991, all of those ethnic groups immediately asked to not be in Great Soviet Union, which is why Ukraine became an independent state, and Kazakhstan became an independent state, and Uzbekistan became an independent state, and Estonia became its own sovereign state, all based on their ethnic majority in those countries / states. So the proof is in the pudding. Whoever thinks that the Russians weren't in charge of Soviet Union, I'm like, I'm sorry, you kind of just don't know what you're talking about. I can recommend some books. It's cool. However, back to balling with Stalin. This guy did unify the state and unify the Soviet Union principles and did expand the territory, but he did it at the expense of a lot of ethnic groups within that territory and a lot of ethnic Russians themselves, by the way. Side note, Stalin was ethnically Georgian, so he wasn't even ethnically Russian. But the majority of the government, the vast majority of the government, are ethnic Russians. So this is a guy that killed millions and perhaps tens of millions of his own citizens to consolidate power all to himself, to literally intimidate and scare the living shit out of the Soviet population, which includes many ethnicities, mostly Russian, into falling into line, supporting the state at all costs, supporting him at all costs. And he's the one that entrenched the Cold War. And now we can take a TV timeout. So I'm going to do this first. If you are currently in this chat still at 1 hour and 17 minutes later, email me right now at joboyer@vt.edu, joboyer@vt.edu. Give me your screen name and give me your real name, and you just earned 10 points of credit. Now, if you're watching a recording of this, it doesn't count. This is only a little bonus for the live folks, all right? Don't be jealous. Send an email. Give me your screen name. And by the way, shout me out with your screen name here so I know that you're really here. Screen name and real name and email. You just earned 10 points. I don't even want to do quizzes anymore. I just want to give points to people that have been tuning in. But I'll do a quiz if you want. So, having said that, I'm going to take a quick refresher. And then I'm going to do, in 10 minutes, M. Rafflin is still here. Bob Ash is still here. Brighton is still up in here, too. Livia, cool. I will now do a very rapid fire Cold War stuff. First time chatter from Hoodie Boy 6. There we go. I was hoping to get some first time chatters in here. We want to grab some points. Callista Malfoy, I know you're always in the hizzle. Hanky Bear is not even a student, but I will give you a free glass of wine. Get on in here. Sergeant Gummy Bear is back in the hizzle. Welcome, Gummy. Welcome back, I should say. So I will now do a rapid fire round, and I almost feel bad for doing this because I feel like all the people here are probably super wicked smart, so you might know all this stuff already. Although when I asked this last week, I said, hey, does anybody want me to kind of do a rough review of the Cold War? And a bunch of you said yes. So I'm going to hold it to 12 minutes. At 9:30, we're stopping. Here we go. I could even pick up on this on next Monday to start out. But if you don't know this stuff in 12 minutes, now it's 11, this helps you understand Putin's motivation, but also the rest of the 20th century history of the Soviet Union and Russia that will help you understand Putin's motivations, but also how things have played out for Russia. Why they have a bit of a confidence issue and why they still do not like Team West. Here we go. Stalin is the one that really entrenched this whole Cold War thing. That is the commies on one side versus Team West on the other side, led by the United States and its European allies. What was that all about? Well, Cold War crash course. Crash course, 10 minutes left. Let's do this. In less than 10 minutes, which of course we won't do. But the first thing you need to understand is Russian expansion into Eastern Europe historically in the last 100 years and Putin's reconquest of Eastern Europe started back in World War I. I already told you all that Tsar Nicholas II was an idiot, for lack of a better word, and was pulled into a war that he did not need to be pulled into. And they sucked so bad at executing that war that they were losing it. And so when Vladimir Lenin, who I've also now introduced to you, when he was coming to power, he was saying, hey, all Russian citizens should support our communist movement. And a lot of people did. And they did not because they even understood what communism was. But Vladimir Lenin says, if you support us overthrowing this idiot czar, I will immediately get us out of World War I. First and foremost, I am stopping Russian aggression in World War I because we're just losing. And he made good on his word. So when Lenin got into power in 1917, when the king abdicated, when the czar abdicated, he immediately said, we're out. We're done with World War I. And all the territory we've lost up to this point because of idiot Tsar Nicholas II and Rasputin, have it. We have bigger fish to fry. Now, in the back of his head, Lenin was like, oh, we're going to go get that back. But we have to put our internal house in order first. So we're going to get rid of the king, czar. We're going to reformat the economy and the political system. And then when we get our shit together, we're going to go back and get our stuff that we lost in World War I. That is super important to understand. Super important. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look at the maps. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I believe, in 1918 was kind of the official when Lenin and his funky communist crew said, we'll sign this treaty in that territory, we're done. We don't care. The German Empire, by the way, lost World War I as well. So all that territory that Russia walked away from, which used to be part of Russia, they gave it to Germany. Then Germany lost. And so all of that territory you see in pink in that treaty ends up becoming this next map over here in red. Those are countries that then became, for a very brief period of time, independent states. So Russia gave it up to get out of the war. Then Germany gave it up because they lost. And so especially Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Poland were like, oh, we're free. Okay, cool. We're independent. And they were recognized as independent states right up to the time that World War II started. But it's super important to understand that Lenin and then Stalin were super pissed that they lost that territory and they had every intention on getting them back. So when World War II started, when Germany was humiliated, embarrassed, and gave up territory in World War I, this hilarious idiot named Hitler came to power. And he's like, well, we're going to go get our territory back. And originally, and not this many Americans know this, I don't know why, but let's learn it now together. Originally, Stalin, in charge of Great Soviet Union at the time, did a non-aggression pact with Hitler, which meant they got together and said, Hitler said, hey, look, Stalin, here's the deal. I'm going to take over the world. I'm starting with Europe. And as long as you don't get in the way, if you don't bother me, don't bother the German Nazi Third Reich, we won't attack you. And by the way, you can have parts of Eastern Europe that you lost, you can have those back. And Stalin was like, seems like a good deal. I'll take back the territory we wanted anyway, and I won't get in your way. Have it. Have Europe. We don't particularly like them. The last European we knew was Napoleon, and he invaded us. So we don't care about Europe. Have it. That was the Pact of Non-Aggression signed in 1939. If you don't know, the end of the story is, it actually turned out, shockingly, that Hitler was a huge dumbass. And not only was he a dumbass who decided to slaughter tons of Jews and other ethnic minorities, he was a dumbass because he decided to attack Russia too. And because he reneged on that original deal he had with Stalin, Stalin was like, well, I'm pretty much a psychopath, but boy, that Hitler is nuts. And so Stalin then turned to join the good guys, in quotes. And please don't anybody try to shame me for saying good guys. I'm saying good guys in quotes. Because we can all agree that the Third Reich was the bad guys. So everybody fighting against the Reich, therefore, for a time, is the good guys. And so Stalin said, well, he was jackalope crazy, so I guess I'll join Team West to help defeat the Third Reich. And that's how you ended up in this bizarre twist of fate for the first and last time in modern history that great Soviet Union, aka Russia, was in alliance with the United States and the Western European countries in a unified effort to crush Nazi Germany. And you know the end of the story. Crush they did. And it's often overlooked in Western history, by the way. The Russians actually did a lot of the heavy lifting in this. And what I mean by that is Russia fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front was far deadlier than U.S. and France fighting the Nazis. I'm sorry. Russia fighting the Nazis on the Eastern Front was far more lethal than the Western forces fighting the Nazis on the Western Front. So the Soviet Union was fighting from the East. The Team West, led by the U.S., U.K., and France, is fighting from the West, the pincer movement. And the battle, the pitched battles and the fighting and the death and destruction, honestly, was just way worse on the Russian side. Millions and millions and millions of dead Russians. Millions. Utter destruction on the Eastern Front. Just horrific death and destruction. People fighting in trenches with shovels because they ran out of ammunition, beating each other to death. Just the worst of the human experience. And Russia did a lot of heavy lifting because without Russia's involvement, I should say Soviet Union, but Russia, without Russia's involvement in World War II, it could have very easily gone the other way. Hitler having to divide his forces and taking tremendous losses fighting the Russians is partly why the West could sweep in so hardcore from the West. And by the way, the U.S. and the U.K. and French lost a lot of forces too, but it pales in comparison numerically to what the Russians lost. But again, I'm now getting into the full Russian lecture, so let me fast forward. End of World War II. Team West comes in from the West. Team East, the Russians, come in from the East. We stamp out the Nazis. Everybody meets in the middle of Europe and high fives. It's all great, we won. And this map is showing you about exactly where Russian/Soviet forces high five with the Western forces. And it's interesting to note the coloration on this map because as soon as the war is over, everybody hates each other again. Okay? And everybody hates each other so much that the Iron Curtain falls. If you never heard that reference, it is a Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill is the one who coined the phrase. Speaking at a military academy here in the U.S. An Iron Curtain has descended upon the continent, and the ancient capitals of Eastern Europe are now under Soviet domination, where on the West are the free democracies that we support. And it coincides exactly with the territories that were held when the Nazi Third Reich collapsed. Okay? This becomes the Iron Curtain. This becomes the battleground between Eastern and Western Europe. This is the front line of what we now, in hindsight, call the Cold War. Now, the things that I want you to glean from this is looking at these maps real quick. And I saw you, M. Woffer says, America, and the Blind Barber says there's a good movie about this called Rizev? Pretty great shovel fight scene, too. Can you email me that, Blind Barber? I do not know that film, and I actually usually know most references to film. I'm curious about that. Thank you, Blind Barber. So look at this map right here. All this, I'm going to show you 4 maps in rapid-fire consequence because we're already down to 1 minute. 1914, look at the Russian Empire. That's pre-World War I. Watch close. Everybody watching? Are you watching? Are you watching? 1919 is post-World War I. The Russians, because of their communist revolution and their losses in World War I that they walked away from, you see they lost what's now Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, even Romania. That's gone. Watch it, watch it, watch it. Post-World War II, they gain Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania back. And by the way, these maps haven't even shown you that Ukraine was temporarily an independent state, but for so little time because Stalin reconquested it very quickly that it doesn't even show up in this flash map series I'm giving you. Again, important to understand that so you understand the Ukrainian war happening right now. Ukraine, between World War I and World War II, did not want to be part of Great Soviet Union and did declare its independence, but got reabsorbed even before World War II broke out. Great Soviet Union under Stalin grabbed back the Ukrainians after he killed, I don't know, somewhere between 2 and 4 million of them by starving them to death intentionally in something called the Holodomor. Holodomor. Somebody help me out with that. I can't pronounce it. An intentional starving of millions of Ukrainians. There's been bad blood between Great Soviet Union and Ukraine, and perhaps even Kievan Rus and Ukraine for a very long time. So that's why I teach this stuff. The modern war happening that Putin wants to take back this country, this has bad blood for hundreds of years. It's shocking in today's world because nobody knows history. It's not shocking at all if you know even half of what I've been talking about tonight. So 1945, Great Soviet Union, as one of the victors in World War II, takes back Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine for a time that was independent. And then finally, they then hold what I call kind of fake elections, right? And what I mean by fake election is the Russians occupied these territories in pink post-World War II, the very same way that American, British, and French forces occupied the western side of the continent. At the end of the war, remember, this is a military maneuver. And there's tanks and people with guns and missiles and grenades. And all of these heavily armed humans come together in the middle of what's we call Europe now. And Soviet Union occupied and liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, who we all hate. And Team West occupied and liberated Western Europe from the Nazis, whom we all hate. So it wasn't until this juncture that we started to then say, oh, okay, wait a minute, but who's in charge now? And Team West said, well, these are all independent states. France is going to become France. Austria is going to become Austria again. Finland will become Finland again. Germany will become Germany again. And the Russians said, okay, kind of. But we're here occupying these. And so as you all are helping Austria and Switzerland and Germany and Luxembourg and Belgium rebuild from the war, we, having liberated Eastern Europe, are going to stay over here. And we're going to help Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. We're going to help them rebuild. Right? And at the time, the U.S. and its allies probably were thinking, well, this sounds like a load of horse shit. But the USSR was our ally that helped defeat the Nazis, so nobody could call bullshit. And everybody said, okay, but you are going to let them become independent states. And Great Soviet Union said, sure. In fact, we're going to help them become states so much, we're going to help hold elections here. And so, lo and behold, the Soviet Union helped organize elections in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, et al. And strangely enough, all of those countries voted to become communist. I know. It's crazy. I think you see where I'm going with this. These are staged elections. Not only did all these states vote to become communist, they also voted to align themselves with Great Soviet Union. So by 1945, let's call it 1950, 1960, Russia, as you now see from this map, / the USSR, got back all of the territories that had lost in World War I, some of them that they just reabsorbed outright, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Ukraine. And then they also kind of absorbed other states in Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone, an area of a perpetual border insecurity. So they said, well, no. Poland's independent. Romania is a sovereign state. Look, these countries lit up in pink. They had a seat at the United Nations. They were treated as independent states. But everybody kind of knew they were puppet states of the Soviet Union. In their defense, the Soviet Union could easily argue, look, dudes, of course, we have a vested interest in controlling these states because these states just attacked us. These states were part of the German Empire, and before that, they were part of the Napoleonic Empire. So there's a long history of Western European invading Russia. There is not a long history of Russia invading Western Europe. So we're going to control these states as a buffer zone because you people are crazy. And that's a point to be made, okay? Now I'm going to finish up. I'm already 5 minutes over. Sorry. I really thought I could do it in 12. But now I can finish up and we can come back to this, because what also was happening simultaneously as Eastern Europe became vassal states / puppet states of Great Soviet Union is that other things were occurring in Western Europe. And by the way, the countries that collectively, voluntarily, but not so much really voluntarily, that volunteered to become vassal states of the Great Soviet Union, they formed a pact called the Warsaw Pact. So all those countries in pink that weren't really sovereign states, but they had a seat at the UN, were part of a defensive pact called the Warsaw Pact. Now, why did they form the Warsaw Pact? I'm skipping ahead because I'm out of time. They formed a unified defense group to counter the growth of Western institutions. I'm going to fast forward real quick and then come back, because as you now well know, the Soviet Union does not last forever. The Great Union of Soviet Socialist Republics does collapse eventually in 1991, and it goes from being a singular political unit called the USSR. It collapses and forms 15 new countries, as I suggested earlier in this lecture. 14 of those countries are other groups that have other dominant ethnic groups. So Estonia is predominantly ethnically Estonian. Kazakhstan is predominantly ethnically Kazakh. And they used to be sub-states of the Soviet Union that petitioned to not be part of the Soviet Union as soon as they could, okay? So they went from one single giant world power, superpower even, into 15 independent sovereign states at the stroke of a pen. So Russia, at the end of the game here in the end of the 20th century, went from being a superpower to being a part, at 1/15 of its former power, still with the vast majority of resources, vast majority of people, vast majority of land, but still a fraction of what they were, and that was very damaging to their psyche, and it still is, okay? And so stepping back, I was just kind of painting the rest of the picture of how that ends, to go back to understand why Vladimir Putin's maps that he considers the most threatening and the most important to his brain are these that I showed you last lecture. The before one is, this is where Great Soviet Union either outright controlled places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus were part of Soviet Union, and then Poland, East Germany, Czech Republic, those are all vassal states. So this is all what they used to control outright, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they lost all that stuff. All these countries, they lost 14 sovereign states' territories. They lost the territories, they lost the resources on those territories, including significant agricultural resources in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. Take that point down in your brain. Ukraine is quite important, huge food producer. They lost the territory, they lost the resources, they lost the agriculture, they lost the people. So even their population declines rapidly simply because of this redrawing of borders, all right? At the same time, during Great Soviet Union, ethnic Russian people had moved all over the place. So this map is showing you where under Stalin and other leaders, they intentionally moved people. And sometimes this happened naturally, but intentionally moved ethnically Russian people to other states in today's world. So there's a huge amount of ethnic Russian people in Kazakhstan. And if you look at Ukraine, look at the Crimean Peninsula. It's almost predominantly ethnically Russian people. There's a significant Russian population in Latvia, in Estonia, in Georgia. All of these places are groups of humans called Russians that are now not in a political entity called Russia anymore. And if you remember back from the last week's lecture, I said it's a very big deal to understand that Vladimir Putin made a speech back in 2014 where he said, "It is my duty to protect ethnic Russians. I am the Slavic savior. I have to protect ethnic Russians wherever they are." And that is in direct contrast to the modern definition of sovereignty and nation states. Sovereignty in today's world is we all respect our borders. And the governments of those borders, the governments that control that territory inside those borders, they have ultimate control over their people. And Vladimir Putin in 2014 said, "I don't believe that anymore. I believe I'm going old school, literally old school. I believe I have to protect Russian people. And I don't give a shit if they're in Kazakhstan. I don't give a shit if they're in Estonia." In other words, I don't care about the modern definitions of sovereignty and nation states. I am here to protect Russians. And now perhaps you understand why that's so important, because of the crash and burn, the dissolution of the Soviet Union left ethnic Russians in all these other states, particularly Ukraine. And this map right here is showing you by coloration. The darker it is to brown to orange to red, or is it yellow to orange to brown to red, the darker the color is the more ethnic Russians. Obviously, Russia itself is red. It's almost all Russians. But look at Ukraine. It's almost evenly divided. Eastern Ukraine has a lot of ethnic Russians in it. Dude, can I stop this lecture right now and you kind of understand already why this war in Ukraine is happening? Vladimir Putin said 7 years ago, wait a minute, 2014, that's 9 years ago. He said 9 years ago, I have to protect ethnic Russians. Look at the map. There's a bunch of ethnic Russians in Ukraine that he has to go protect. And this invasion that he did almost exactly a year ago to the day, I think next week is the year, he's going to protect ethnic Russians. He's making good on his claim that he is the Slavic savior. He has to save Russians. But also note, there's a whole bunch of ethnic Russians in Estonia, and there's a shit ton in Kazakhstan. So that's why I could end the lecture now, and I will. That's why this is so problematic. For folks that say, oh, well, I don't like Team West. I don't like the U.S. I don't like U.S. foreign policy. I think NATO's threatening. They back Russia in a corner. It really doesn't matter. You can blame whoever you want. You can deflect blame from Vladimir Putin for starting this war. That's fine. Let's just say it's not his fault. Let's say he had no choice. What I need you to understand is the Western response. And the Western response takes Putin at his word. And 9 years ago, he said, and look at this map, he said, I have to protect Russians no matter what sovereign state they're in. And now I'm doing it because I'm taking over Ukraine, and I'm going to take over specifically the parts of Ukraine that have Russian people in it. Team West looks at this and says, this is problematic because there's other countries that have ethnic Russians in them. And by the way, Kazakhstan has to be shitting its collective shorts because there is an ultimate hell ton of ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan. And if Putin is successful at taking over Ukraine, guess who's next? It doesn't take much imagination. And quite frankly, we can just believe this man. We can take him at his word. And if he is allowed to take over Ukraine, I think it's quite appropriate that the Western countries, and more so Kazakhstan, are saying, okay, does that mean Russia owns us too? Because there's ethnic Russians here? How about that? How about we cut there? Because I know the next slide's about the EU growing and NATO growing, which is also what's bothering Putin. And we'll pick up there next week. But we'll end with that. That itself should help you understand Putin motivations. I haven't even started talking about Putin yet, but I felt it necessary to talk about the Cold War in the context of what's happening today. The main takeaway here is 100 years, the last almost exact 100 years, but let's call it since 1917. So 100 and what's that? 8 years. Is it 7? Somebody do the math for me. 108 years of Russia fretting about territory lost, regained, lost, regained, and lost in Europe. 100 years of we own this, no, we don't own this. No, we own it again. No, we don't. Oh, they're independent now, but we want it back. What's happening in today's world is a part of a larger story that now you know about. I haven't even talked about the man himself yet, but these are the things that he understands, and these are the things that have been motivating him. And I'll stop now because I was supposed to stop 15 minutes ago when I said it was only going to be 12 minutes. I just get passionate about this stuff because I love talking about it. I hope you all do too. Now I'm going to stop talking. If you got any questions or if you just give me a shout out, seriously, you already got 10 points. But give me a shout out and please tell me you learned anything and you like this format and you like this stuff and you want me to keep doing it because I've been talking for like 2 freaking hours now. I just assume there's only 5 of you here and you're having a good time. I hope you are. I hope you're learning. Give me some sort of feedback that says this is a good thing to do. M. Waffer says, so that's why the Russia invaded eastern Ukraine first and had those fake elections in those areas. Exactly correct, M. Waffer. You're getting it already. This is an easily predictable and calculated move. If you understand history, nothing is surprising here. Putin actually, before he invaded, started to say, we're going to recognize parts of eastern Ukraine as independent sovereign states. And we're going to let them vote to see if they want to join Russia. Surprise, surprise, how that vote went. I'll give you one guess. I'll give you 2 guesses, and your first one don't count. It was the same game plan from when they took over Eastern Europe and made Eastern European states into puppet states. It's the same shizzle, different century. That's the name of a book I should write. Same shizzle, different century. First time chatter from Be a Sub Above says, great to see you again, Professor. Well, thank you, Be a Sub Above. First time chatter from Robin Jim says, hi there. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy this, Robin. Bevash says, I like this. M. Waffer says, hell yeah, it's great. Brighton says, more. M. Rafflin says, having a good time. First time chatter from Arqual, that says, whoop, whoop. Thank you for that, Arqual. From Betsa7 says, thank you very much. I absolutely love this format. Absolutely something this format. I just included the word love. I'm actually learning so much from this, and it's always so fun and interesting the way you teach it. Well, thank you, Vetsa. That's why I do it. My pay is unaffected by me doing this. This is all just icing on a cake that I give because I love doing it. And I only want to do it if you guys love eating the cake. So that's why I don't really need my ego stroked. I'm good. I lead a good life. I'm fine. I'm quite a happy human being. But I'm trying to figure out how best to teach into the future. And so that's why I'm asking for feedback. You don't got to tell me that it's great and you love me just because it's me. Does this work? Is this what we should keep doing more of? Because you can tune in and the graphics are good. Or you can make suggestions. Say, I want more of this and less of this. It should be shorter. It should be longer. You should have more graphics on it. I'll listen to whatever. This is all a grand experiment in an effort to teach you all better of what's going on in the modern world. Vikram Tiwari, who's been with me forever up in the hizzle from India, says, this is a great thing to do. Thank you, Vikram, as always. Livia says, I've been learning a lot in these office hours. Bivash says, you should do the same lecture format, but for China in the future. You got it. And Bivash also loves eating the cake. Let them eat cake on Twitch. One Flux TV says, I'm a wine student, but like tuning into these politics, history, geography sessions. Super interesting. Oh, and that reminds me, there's probably only like 10 of you in here, which is cool. 25 people. We should do this thing that we've done in the past that actually some people taught us to do last year. We need to do a bum rush of another room. A raid. So on Twitch, you call it a raid. So for those of you that are Twitch users, go find me a room, a chat, a channel, whatever you call it, that we can raid. And for those of you that are new to Twitch, as am I still, I just come here and talk. A raid is when all of us, because I'm now going to wind this down and walk away. And a raid is when all 25 of us go burst into someone else's channel unexpectedly, especially if it's a smaller channel that only has like 20 or 30 or 40 viewers, and then suddenly 25 people show up and we just all start raising hell. We're like, we love you. This is great. Woo! It's like a big boost for that channel, and it makes them really happy, and it's kind of fun. So one time we did to a furniture maker from like Iowa. And he was like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. So if you all can hang out with me for one more minute, find us a channel to raid, and we will wrap up here and go raid the channel. Back to the comments. By the way, thanks you, OneFlux TV, for tuning in. I'm really sorry, OneFlux, for losing office hours for wine class last Wednesday. The bar suddenly got slammed, and I couldn't even make it back to the computer because we got so overwhelmed. Vetsa's given the LOLs. Mara Barrera is saying, as someone who's currently listening to this podcast, occasionally watching the slides, I've learned a ton just by listening to your words. Thank you so much, Amara. Livia says, I believe Animal Farm and 1984 by George Orwell are based a lot off these topics. You are correct, Livia. That's what they're all. They're all allegories. Allegories? I think it's called allegory for Russia, Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany. Yes. Structuring society where very few people are all important and have all power. Brighton says, George Orwell. What is George Orwell? Is that somebody we need to raid? And M. Offer says, Animal Farm is an all-time book. All right, but I know some of you are tuning out, so let's find a place to raid real quick. And Katie, are you the one that does that? Okay. Katie's getting ready to raid us somewhere.
No, you have to do it.
Oh, okay. Well, how?
Someone to raid though. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. While we're figuring out a place to raid, Be a Sub says, would love to learn some more about China and its situation, especially the predictions about its population growth, changes, and economy. How about a whole lecture on China? Because it's probably what you're going to get on a pre-recorded lecture. We still haven't sent out the class survey. Damn it. I'll try to remember to do the class survey tonight for you to pick your regions. But China always wins, which is why I already have.
This guy's a super physicist.
Oh, a physicist. You guys want to crash? You want to raid a physicist podcast?
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
about,
Twitchcast.
Like, planets and going places.
So what do we do?
Atmosphere Lounge.
What do I do? So do we all just click on that, Katie?
No, I think you.
Okay, don't do anything yet. All right. Katie's going to do it here. And by the way, for those of you who don't know who Katie is, this is Katie. She does all the heavy lifting. She does all the work behind the scenes.
This dude.
Okay, everybody hang in, and then when we switch, so thank you all so much.
Raid channel.
We're going to raid channel right now. You guys have a great night, and then do a bunch of chats and scream when you get into this new channel.
Here we go.
There it is.
Hey, we're on it.
Boom!
8, 7, 6, 5,
15.
18, 20. I got 18.
18.
Right now.
Rating now.
Awesome.
So I forget, what do we do now?
We just rated, and now you should be. Oh, you should talk in there. Sorry. Let's see what he says though. Turn the audio on.
Water could be water. Basically, just type, and it doesn't do anything. All it does is you need something to spit up so you can go in that direction.
Okay, so this is not a good channel?
Real fuel is the fuel that powers this fusion thing. So however hot you can get it, the hotter, the faster you can go. And so this ISP, hey, look at all these new people here. Hey, look,
Yeah, I'm like, this guy's cool.
if I remember correctly, and unfortunately I don't know the crowd here that can correct me on these things,
So he's not calling us out. So
No,
this.
he just did. He
Okay.
said, "Oh my God, thank you, all writers." He's in the middle of a thought though. Talking
Yeah, I know.
about how it's-
Basically, you just need something. It doesn't have to be something even ionized. You just need a mass that you can chuck at the back of the rocket. And so the hotter that rocket gets,
And we really threw him off.